It's Mode 7 Incarnate in this introductory episode of Mode 7. Hello and welcome to Mode 7, a chronological survey of the Super NES library. Like Good Nintentions, Mode 7 will focus strictly on American releases in the order in which Nintendo has officially designated their release. This series will be updated much less frequently than Game Boy World or Good Intentions, but every once in a while a man needs a break from 8-bit tech. For those occasions, there's Mode 7. The term Mode 7, of course, refers to the trademark visual gimmick built into the Super NES. Fittingly, the very first subject of the series, futuristic racer F-Zero, offers a perfect summation of what Mode 7 was all about. In short, Nintendo made a lot of unconventional technological choices when speccing out the Super NES console's design. The lead behind the Super NES project was none other than NES designer Masayuki Uemura, and the new machine shared a lot in common with his previous console creation. For starters, Uemura stuck with a Ricoh-manufactured processor for the Super NES, a next-generation version of the 6502 variant in the NES. There's some speculation that this was an artifact of the original plan to include NES backward compatibility in the new system, but it's just as likely that Uemura's own history led him to stick with a processor family with which he had extensive experience. The 16-bit 5A22 chip in the Super NES was a capable workhorse, but it was clocked at about half the speed as the CPUs that powered competing systems like TurboGrafx-16 and Sega's Genesis. This would prove to be a significant bottleneck for programmers and likely accounts for the relative lack of high-speed action games on Super NES. Still, even though Nintendo's new machine ran at half the speed of the other guys, Uemura wasn't exactly sending it into a cold and uncaring world with nothing to back it up. Rather than focus on raw speed, the Super NES instead revolved around special features. It could display an impressive number of colors at once, drawn from a palette that eclipsed those of other systems of the time. And of course, it had that crazy Sony audio chip that centered around digitally sampled sounds rather than generating waves or FM synthesis. Controlling all those different presentation options were the console's graphical modes, 7 in total. In simple terms, these modes determine the number of background layers available to programmers and the color depth available to those backgrounds. There are some other factors at work for individual modes, such as Mode 5 and 6's ability to produce double-resolution graphics, as seen in things like Secret of Mana's menus. By and large, though, the modes simply determine the relative complexity of a game's appearance. You can have complex visuals or colorful visuals, and the hardware gave developers the ability to easily select which they preferred to emphasize. Hardware Mode 7, however, switched things up slightly. It gave developers the ability to create a single 256-color background, a far more limited arrangement than other modes. But unlike in those other modes, here devs could apply interesting effects to the background. Working in Mode 7, developers could rotate, scale, and distort the background. It was, all things considered, a pretty basic tool set of abilities that we take for granted in the age of polygons. At the time, however, no other home console offered anything that even began to compare, especially not as a basic built-in hardware feature. It was a massive advantage for the Super NES, creating simple and effective illusions of 3D visuals. Not surprisingly, Nintendo built one of the console's launch titles entirely around showcasing this effect. F-Zero. It's one part racing game, one part tech demo, and it's pretty darn good in both respects. Nintendo published just 2 games alongside the Super NES when it launched in Japan as the Super Famicom, and F-Zero belonged to that illustrious pair. The other member of that duo, Super Mario World, was precisely what you'd expect, a 16-bit iteration of Super Mario Bros. With all the bells and whistles that entailed. F-Zero, on the other hand, existed entirely for the sake of showing off the new console's technical potential, unbounded by familiar franchises or the constraints of a known property. There were no limitations on what F-Zero could be, no fan expectations demanding it adhere to certain rules. The game came to us courtesy of none other than Shigeru Miyamoto, head of Nintendo EAD. After putting the wraps on Super Mario Bros. 3 back in 1988, Miyamoto and his teams immediately set to work on creating spectacular launch titles for the company's new console, and F-Zero was nothing if not a spectacle. In practice, F-Zero boils down to a fairly standard racing game. Players control a vehicle, zip around increasingly complex tracks, and try to edge out other racers in order to take first place. Nothing about F-Zero seemed standard in 1990 when the console launched in Japan, and at its American launch a year later. It looked amazing, moved at an insanely fast speed, and incorporated its futuristic setting into both its aesthetics and its mechanics. Miyamoto was no stranger to racing games, of course. 1985's Excitebike had served a similar purpose to F-Zero, to be a showcase for the console's unique features. You can even see carryovers from Excitebike's design in F-Zero, including the ability to adjust your attitude on a jump to alter the strategic value of hang time, and the way you don't really have a proper race against a fixed number of opponents, but rather go out on the track against a motley army of randomly positioned duplicates. In Excitebike's case, Miyamoto put together a racer that somehow emphasized platforming as much as driving, making the most of the NES's effortless horizontal scrolling capabilities. By the time the Super NES came around, of course, side-scrolling was old hat. But Mode 7 was bonkers amazing, so that's what F-Zero emphasized. The game adopted a perspective similar to Sega's superscalar arcade racer Outrun, with a camera behind the player's vehicle and the course stretching out ahead at a sharply tilted angle. This visual reference probably wasn't accidental, because the natural Outrun comparison demonstrated precisely what F-Zero, and by extension, the Super NES was capable of. Even arcade racing games at this point gave players either a complex track and a fixed top-down view, or else a behind-the-cockpit view of gentle curves and lengthy straightaways. But F-Zero combined the best of both worlds. It presented both highly complex racetracks and an immersive angle on the action, something that was rarely seen to that point. After all, Sega's Virtua Racing was still a couple of years away, and while Atari had already published hard driving in arcades, that game had been a slow-paced, finicky car simulation. F-Zero was fast, insanely fast, and it demanded quick reflexes and a steady hand all at once. The secret, of course, lay in the Super NES's Mode 7 function. F-Zero's racetracks consisted of a single giant bitmap graphic. If you were to view the tracks as flat backgrounds at standard Super NES resolution, they'd generally be about 2x4 screens in size. But, using the magic of Mode 7, F-Zero could stretch these simple bitmaps, skew them, rotate them, and create a convincing illusion that they were, in fact, real three-dimensional courses. Clever visual design helped sell the illusion. EAD's graphical designers used some effective illustrative tricks to create a sensation of depth, of a raised racetrack hovering above futuristic landscapes, flanked by electric orbs that acted as bumpers and hazards to prevent driving off the road. Bitmap-based driving games to this point had been limited to creating the impression of a road with simple line rendering tricks, or by using Sega's favorite technique of sandwiching numerous sprites together in sequence. Some games based around the latter concept had yielded impressive results. Power Drift, for example, managed to add dizzying verticality to its tracks. Now, that was something Nintendo couldn't do with Mode 7. F-Zero's tracks are as flat as a board. On the other hand, Power Drift was an arcade game that fared poorly on contemporary consoles, and F-Zero compensated for its lack of variable height with intricate tracks that convulsed into hairpin turns and even doubled back on themselves with gaps and jumps. And most of all, F-Zero was fast. Even now it makes for a remarkably intense racing experience, despite the fact that time and the march of technology have laid its illusions bare. Your sci-fi hover cars scream down narrow, hazardous tracks crowded by other racers at speeds in excess of 400 kilometers per hour, and you really feel that speed, especially when you hit a few consecutive turbo boosts and briefly double your speed to 800 or 900 kilometers per hour. The tracks zip along at a silky smooth 60 frames per second, and this is one of those games where the frame rate really does matter. The speed and complexity of F-Zero's maps sells the illusion that you're zooming along on some deadly far future racetrack. Were the game to run slower, or were it to present you with boring simple loops to race along, F-Zero would fall apart. Instead, it presents a white-knuckle hardcore driving experience, almost uncharacteristic for Nintendo, and it's fantastic. It's all the more impressive when you look at the rest of the Super NES library and realize that very few games that would follow in the next decade or so could come close to offering F-Zero's sense of exhilarating speed. If more of the console's library had felt like this, Sonic the Hedgehog's entire marketing premise might have collapsed in on itself.
Super Mario World, wow!
What's this one?
Oh, this is a Sonic the Hedgehog from Sega Genesis.
F-Zero builds on its futuristic setting to go all in on unusual play mechanics too. For starters, the game system revolves around a damage feature that's pure video games. In no way does it resemble actual racing physics. Each racer's car has its own energy meter connected to an energy shield. Once your shield collapses, your car explodes on the track. It's pretty intense, a racing game where you can die. Not only that, but F-Zero also includes actual instant kill scenarios, such as jumping off the track, in which your vehicle will explode even at full shield strength. F-Zero plays out as a strange beast, a racing game in which you have a stock of lives and can even earn 1-ups with a strong score. Some of the tracks can be downright brutal, and it's entirely possible to blaze through the first few races in a circuit only to hit a wall with a tricky jump or turn and see a game over. F-Zero's ping-pong-like physics play a huge part in this. The racer's energy shields cause cars to behave in wild, unpredictable ways. If you strike something hard enough, whether a wall or another racer, your car will bounce off of it. The faster you're going, the more vigorous the rebound, and frequently, those collisions will happen at an oblique angle that results in your car being spun completely around to face a wall or even drive backward. You can use this mechanic to your advantage, sending other racers careening into a disastrous rebound, but doing so requires great mastery of the controls. Otherwise, a collision is far more likely to ruin your day. Unlike in its spiritual successor Mario Kart, when you lose a race at the last minute in F-Zero, it's less likely because of rubber band AI, and more likely because of an unlucky collision that bounces you in every direction but forward. You don't need to complete a race to lose it though. No, you'll often know well in advance if you're not going to place because again, unlike in other racers, F-Zero introduces the possibility that you will die horribly mid-race. If your car shields drop to 0, boom, that's it. It's very possible in certain tricky tracks to snag a wall or another vehicle at a glancing angle that sends you into a murderous pinball frenzy, bouncing helplessly across a course's energy barriers until your vehicle explodes. It's also possible for your car to explode if you fly off the track. Unlike in Mario Kart, this doesn't cause Lakitu to retrieve you and scold you for your clumsiness with a modest time penalty. Leaving the track with a misaimed jump causes your vehicle to detonate instantly. It's harsh. There are some tricky jumps in a few courses, and you have to make each jump multiple times since you complete 5 laps per course. And at any one of these jumps, you can easily slip up and lose the race. Do it a few times in a row, and your entire performance on the circuit turns out to be for naught. The high speeds and high stakes of F-Zero made for a racing game like none other before it. It wasn't the first sci-fi racer, and it wasn't the first racing game to use visual shenanigans to create the impression of an immersive 3D racetrack. But no other racer had ever combined breakneck speed, visual immersion, wild physics, and ruthless challenge so effectively. By this point, Nintendo's software development processes had come a long way from the rough-hewn early days of NES black box software, and the undeniable excellence and craftsmanship they brought to game design really came to the fore here, a genuine arcade-caliber experience on a home console. F-Zero was kind of a brazen act of false promises for what lay ahead for the Super NES. It promised a certain white-knuckle intensity that the console didn't really deliver on with any consistency. And it was pretty convincing at first if you didn't pay much attention to, say, fellow launch game Gradius 3. That's not the only part of F-Zero that feels a little off in hindsight. You can see a lot of seams and compromises within the game, things that didn't seem so noticeable at the time when we were blinded by what was honestly an unparalleled home gaming experience, but that stand out conspicuously 25 years later. For starter, the game only includes 4 vehicles. The bottleneck may have come from the system's RAM, since each vehicle had to be drawn from roughly 24 different angles apiece at about 6 different levels of scale to create a convincing illusion of rotation and distance on the track. Perhaps not surprisingly then, F-Zero lacked a multiplayer element. Super Mario Kart would eventually adapt F-Zero's Mode 7 tech trick into a split-screen format with 8 different racers, but that kart was much larger, and it included the DSP-1 add-on chip to enable its advances, something not available for F-Zero, which fit everything within the boundaries of the Super NES's innate limitations. While F-Zero still feels pretty intense even by modern standards, the illusion of its Mode 7 gimmickry has proven less resilient. The stretchy sheet of racetrack trick would become thoroughly played out over the Super NES's life. And unlike proper polygonal racetracks, F-Zero's tracks are 100% completely flat in nature. Not only that, but the tracks feature very few dynamic elements. You'll encounter recharge zones and speed boosters, sure, but aside from the racers themselves and a handful of spray-based objects like mines, the tracks seem awfully desolate. Even if it comes off as a little flimsy in retrospect though, F-Zero made a huge impression on kids back in the day. If Super Mario World was the game that kept new Super NES players glued to their consoles for months at a time to find all 96 exits, F-Zero was the game that caught their attention in the first place. And it made for some decent counter-programming to Sega's Super NES is so slow campaigns too. The game has seen quite a few sequels, though only F-Zero X for Nintendo 64 really moved the needle. F-Zero GX for GameCube arguably took the hardcore difficulty of the series a step too far, and the several Game Boy Advance sequels attempted to reproduce the vibe and look of the Super NES game, which really only served to demonstrate that F-Zero's original tech was very much tied to a specific time and place, which was 1991, not 2004. While the franchise has sat dormant for a decade now, I'm sure Nintendo will eventually do something with it. Certainly it hasn't been forgotten. While the game's cast of weirdo futuristic racers only originally existed in the manual, never to be seen on screen, Captain Falcon would go on to become a key figure in the F-Zero anime, and an iconic mainstay in Smash Bros. So despite some failings, F-Zero helped introduce the Super NES with eye-popping ferocity. It really and truly created the sense that a new generation of game consoles had arrived, visually eclipsing any previous home racer with its combination of tech and finesse. And that was kind of the point. Anyone can make a cool tech demo. The Super NES made a splash in large part because Nintendo made their cool tech demo into an intense, addicting racing game. Next time on Mode 7, whenever that may be, I'll talk about one of the greatest platformers of all time for probably like an hour or so.